Honourable David Parker.
Mr Chairman, can I respond and can I first congratulate the prior speaker, Shane Jones, because I thought that was a very erudite contribution to the debate as to the difficulty that Parliament faces in respect of these issues, and I wanted to say why I thought that this Parliament's missing an opportunity to properly settle this issue. The Labour Party, through the Honourable Dr Michael Cullen, made a submission to the review panel that did say that, amongst other things, that we thought that we should settle this and that appropriate settlement could include codification of these tests. And at the time there was, I thought, a very good editorial or opinion piece published by John Armstrong in the New Zealand Herald. And he said, look, this is a difficult issue for New Zealand. Parliament's had one crack at it. Now, at that time we had the National Party being, I would say, irresponsible, raking up race relations, making it an almost impossible issue to settle properly at the time. And we also had some pretty intemperate comments at the other end of the spectrum. By the time of the panel, we actually had at least the major parties in this House trying to find a way forward that was fair to minority interests and that the country could live with. And so on that basis, the Labour Party said, yes, we supported statutory codification of the test. And at the time, John Armstrong made the point that if you looked at the spectrum of opinion when the Foreshore and Seabed Act was passed, we had the Maori Party, or the precursors to the Maori Party, saying the legislation was far too tough under the Foreshore and Seabed Act. You had Labour Party closer to the Maori Party or the Maori Party precursors than to National in the middle there, and we had the National Party at another extreme of the debate saying that it was far, far too permissive in terms of recognition of unextinguished customary rights. And John Armstrong made the point that since that time the National Party had moved very substantially. They had moved past the position of the Foreshore and Seabed Act and said that they wanted something that was more restored to Maori, for example, the right to go to court. So they moved to there. We moved to there too, and actually we were willing to move even a wee bit further than where National were willing to move. And all that it took in order to settle this issue was an agreement from the Maori Party to move from where they sat to where the National Party had got to, in respect of agreeing that the solution proposed by the National Party was a fair settlement of the issue. And if we had that, it may well be that this Parliament would actually now be expressing unity around this issue, which would be good for our country. But unfortunately, I have to say, I think that the Maori Party and the National Party have failed in their duty to the country, because they said they were going to settle this issue. And rather than the Prime Minister, John Key, ringing up the Maori Party and say, hey, this is the deal, can you live with it? He hasn't done that. And rather than the Maori Party saying or offering, because I don't want to be paternalistic or maternalistic towards the Maori Party, rather than them offering up and saying, we accept this as a fair settlement to the issue, actually the Maori Party said the opposite. They've said this is a first step. They've said it at Tariana Turia level, the Honourable Tariana Turia. The Honourable Peter Sharples has said the same, and that's the leader, or the co-leaders of the Maori Party, and their senior whip has said exactly the same thing. He has said also that this is not a settlement. So on that basis, the National Party asked us to accept the pretence that this is a settlement. And that's where we bailed, because we said we're not going to put up with that fiction, because it is a fiction for the reasons that I have outlined. And so on that basis, we actually got to the point where we said, look, Parliament's had 2 cracks at fixing this. Parliament can't fix it. It can't fix it. It's obvious that Parliament cannot fix what is the appropriate threshold test to the satisfaction of the range of interests that are involved. And as a consequence, we say that this Part 3, and this is the Part 3 that has the threshold test in it, we say it's wrong. We say that we ought not to be pretending that this settles it, and we ought to let these issues play out over time through the courts. Now, I heard the Minister say that would be a bad thing, Mr. Chairman.
Honourable David Parker.
That would be a bad thing because it would take time and it would create uncertainty. Well, the first thing I would say to that is that presumes that this creates certainty. How can that be when we have the Maori Party and various other sectors in society for different reasons saying it doesn't settle it? We're kidding ourselves if we think that by saying it's settled it will be. The reality is it isn't. So that's the first problem with his argument. The second problem with the attorney's arguments in favour of codification, given where we've got to, relates to this suggestion that somehow this will be better because it's simpler and therefore more cost effective. This legislation enables agreements to be progressed through legislation in Parliament. The average cost of a piece of legislation in Parliament, according to the Parliamentary Library, and I got them to give me some advice on this, the average piece of legislation in 2010, including the full cost of running Parliament, is $2.8 million per piece of legislation. $2.8 million per piece of legislation. Now, I'm not saying that that is the full cost of every piece of legislation, because the marginal cost of a piece of legislation is probably not $2.8 million. But I tell you what, it's a lot more than a court action. A court action for people to explore their customary interests and for the court to determine that does not cost millions of dollars. A piece of legislation does. So the idea that through this new process that the government is introducing we're going to have a more cost-effective approach is just wrong. It would be far more cost-effective for taxpayers to fund appropriate contributions to legal aid than it would be to proceed by way of Acts of Parliament in respect of these agreements that are going to come forward. Mr. Chairman, the codification of these tests is highly problematic. There are lots of issues that are left. There are lots of people in New Zealand who are left dissatisfied. There are people who, like Hone Hauera, like the Maori Party, who say that this codification of the test acts as a confiscation of rights. We can never win that argument in this Parliament because the people who believe that never have the ability to test that, because we are removing from the jurisdiction of the court their ability to test it. Through codification, we are putting the issue as to what should be the proper threshold test beyond the jurisdiction of the court. And therefore the sense of injustice from some of the Maori Party supporters will always be there. Conversely, the other people at the other end of the debate who say that the test is far too lax, and they might be right, they too are prevented from having their day in court and arguing what they think. Having had 2 attempts in this Parliament to settle this, we haven't achieved it, and it's time, Mr. Chairman, to acknowledge that reality. There is a supplementary order paper in my name to that effect. Let's put this back to the court. You know, the Maori Party could vote for that tonight and that would be the outcome. That's what they say they wanted originally. The Greens support that, Progressives support that, the ACT Party supports that. I think Hone Hauera would even support it going back to the courts. All it takes is for the Maori Party to vote in favour of that supplementary order paper, or indeed a few people in the National Party, and they're under pressure, were they not whipped, and we could have that solution in this House tonight. We could have this issue settled fairly, setting out a process for everyone to have their day in court, and this issue, the framework, would be settled, taxpayers would be better off, Maori interests would feel justly treated, other interests who feel aggrieved by this legislation would feel justly treated. We tested that at Select Committee across a wide range of submitters, and although it's true that that wasn't a universally accepted, the vast majority of people thought that was the way forward. That is why the Labour Party doesn't support this most crucial part of the bill in its current form. And, Mr Chairman, that is why we have a supplementary order paper to that effect.
Catherine Delahunt.
Kia tēnā koutou te whare.